The envelope smelled like lavender. I noticed that before anything else, before I registered the unfamiliar return address, before I read my name written in handwriting I'd never seen, before any of it made sense. Just that smell, faint and sweet, rising from paper so thick and cream-colored it felt foreign in my hands, like something from another world entirely. My name is Maya Reeves. Most people don't call me much of anything. I was 21 years old, sitting on the edge of a narrow bed in Clearwater Group Home in Memphis, Tennessee, staring at 2 duffel bags and a backpack that held every single thing I owned. The state of Tennessee had officially decided I was no longer its problem. 21 meant the clock had run out. Ready or not, the door was open, and the world was waiting on the other side with no particular interest in whether I was prepared for it. I wasn't. I'd been in the system since I was 6 years old. 15 years of group homes and foster placements that didn't stick, of learning not to hang pictures on walls because you'd only have to take them down, of understanding early that hope was a luxury you rationed carefully. I'd watched other kids get adopted, get chosen, get pulled into families that wanted them. I'd learned to tell myself I didn't mind. I'd learned to lie to myself with real conviction. The envelope had arrived 3 days before my discharge date, handed to me by Miss Carver, my caseworker, a tired woman with reading glasses that lived on the top of her head, and a coffee mug she never seemed to empty. She'd passed it to me without ceremony, the way she passed me everything, with professional gentleness and just enough distance to protect herself from the weight of it all. "Came through the office," she said. "From a law firm. Shelby County." I didn't open it right away. I set it on my nightstand and watched it for 2 days like it might do something unpredictable. In my experience, unexpected letters didn't bring good news. Unexpected anything didn't bring good news. But on the morning of my last day, instant oatmeal dissolving badly in lukewarm water, the familiar hum of the home waking up around me, I finally picked it up and slid my finger under the seal. Inside was a single folded letter on the same heavy cream paper, and beneath it, a smaller envelope with my name written on the front in that same careful, unhurried handwriting. The letter was from an attorney named Gerald Sutton of Sutton and Associates in Shelby County. It informed me, in clear and measured legal language, that my maternal grandfather, one Henry Reeves of Clover Hill, Tennessee, had passed away 6 weeks ago at the age of 77, and that in his will, witnessed and notarized, he had left his entire estate to me. I read it twice, then a third time. I had a grandfather. He was dead, and he had left me something. The estate, according to Mr. Sutton's letter, consisted of a farmhouse on 14 acres in the foothills of the Cumberland Plateau, a working lavender farm, partially operational, a pottery studio attached to the barn, fully equipped, a truck, a dog named Biscuit, and a bank account containing $9,412. $9,000. I had $43 in a bank account I'd opened with a caseworker's help 2 years ago and never managed to put much into. 9,000 might as well have been 9 million. And a farm. 14 acres. I grew up in Memphis. I had never in my life stood in a field. I wasn't sure I would recognize one if it introduced itself. Miss Carver found me still sitting on my bed an hour later, the letter in my lap, the small sealed envelope, the one with my name in that handwriting, still unopened in my hand. "Everything all right, Maya?" "My grandfather died," I said. The words felt strange, like I'd borrowed them from someone else's life. "He left me a farm." She sat down beside me, which she almost never did. She read the letter I handed her and was quiet for a long moment. "Maya." Her voice was different than usual, softer. "This could change everything." I looked at the unopened envelope in my hand. The smaller one. Personal, not legal. My name in that old man's handwriting. I wasn't ready to open it yet. Some doors, once opened, don't close again. I called Mr. Sutton from the payphone outside the home. My phone had died 2 days ago, and I hadn't had the money to put minutes on it. He answered on the second ring, and his voice was the kind of warm and unhurried that made me think of men who had lived long enough to stop being in a rush. "Miss Reeves, I'm so glad you called. I was beginning to worry the letter hadn't reached you." It reached me. I leaned against the brick wall. The Memphis morning was already thick with humidity. I just needed a few days. Of course. No judgment in it. Just acknowledgement. Your grandfather was very specific in his instructions. He wanted you to have the farm and everything in it. He also left you a letter, a personal one, that I understand came with the estate documents. I have it. I looked down at the small envelope in my free hand. I haven't opened it yet. A pause. Gentle. That's all right. Whenever you're ready. When can you come to Clover Hill? There are documents to sign, and frankly, the farm needs someone. It's been sitting quiet since Henry passed, and your grandfather wouldn't have wanted it left alone too long. I can come now, I said, because I had nowhere else to be. No job. No apartment. No plan. The transitional housing list was 4 months long. I can come today. I used $31 of my $43 to buy a bus ticket. The remaining $12 went into my jacket pocket like a talisman. The bus to Clover Hill took 3 hours with a stop in Cookeville. I sat in the back with my duffel bags wedged against my knees and watched Tennessee unspool outside the window. The city giving way to suburbs, suburbs to smaller towns to hills rolling green and gold in the early spring light. My mother had grown up somewhere in this part of the state. I knew almost nothing about her. She'd left when I was 6, circumstances the system described as unable to provide adequate care, which was the official language for a kind of breaking that I'd spent 15 years trying not to think too hard about. I didn't know who my grandfather was to her, whether she'd been close to him, whether she'd left him too, whether any of it was my fault, the way a 6-year-old inevitably believes these things are. I took out the small envelope and turned it over in my hands, looked at my name written there. Maya. Just that. Like he'd known me. Like the name was enough. I opened it somewhere between Cookeville and Clover Hill, with the hills rising gold around the bus and an old man asleep across the aisle. My dear Maya, it began. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't think I've earned it. But I owe you the truth, and I owe you an explanation, and I have spent too many years being a coward about both. I knew about you from the beginning, from the day you entered care. I was contacted. I was asked. And I said no, not because I didn't want you, God help me, but because I was 61 years old and alone and scared, and I told myself I was too old, too set in my ways, too far out in the hills to give a little girl what she needed. I told myself you'd be better off somewhere else. I was wrong. I was a coward. And I have not spent a single day since then without regretting it. The farm is yours, Maya. It has been yours in my heart for 15 years. I've been tending it for you. The lavender fields, the pottery studio, everything in that barn, I built and kept and maintained for the day you might want it. Whether you keep it or sell it or walk away from it entirely, I will understand. It's yours to do with as you choose. But if you go to the barn, and I hope you will, there's something waiting for you in the studio. On the back shelf, behind the canisters of glaze. A box with your name on it. I made it myself. It will tell you everything else. I love you, Maya. I have always loved you. I was just too afraid to find out if you could love me back. Your grandfather, Henry. Clover Hill was the kind of town that seemed to exist slightly outside of time. The main street ran for 4 blocks, a hardware store, a diner, a post office, a church with a hand-painted sign out front. The hills rose all around it, green and ancient, folding over the town like cupped hands. The bus stop was a bench in front of the diner, and when I stepped off with my bags, the air hit me differently than Memphis air. Cleaner. Cooler. Carrying something underneath it that I'd later learned to identify as lavender on the wind from the farms in the hills. Mr. Sutton's office was above the hardware store, a small wood-paneled room with framed botanical prints on the walls and a desk so old it had grooves worn into the surface. He was a man in his late 60s with white hair and the careful stillness of someone who understood that most people who came to see him were carrying something heavy. He shook my hand and didn't comment on the duffel bags. Your grandfather talked about you often, he said, settling across from me. Every time he updated his will, and he updated it 3 times in 15 years, he'd tell me a little more about you, what he imagined you might be like, whether you'd have your mother's stubbornness or her laugh. He smiled. He said he hoped you got her laugh. He said it could light up a room. Something caught in my throat. I swallowed it. We went through the documents. Deed of transfer. Bank account information. Title to a 2009 pickup truck, navy blue, with 140,000 miles on it. A folder of property records. And a note, handwritten on a yellow legal pad, that listed everything currently living or growing on the 14 acres, the lavender fields, eastern and western plots, a kitchen garden, one border collie named Biscuit, currently in the care of a neighbor named Ruth Calloway, one aging barn cat named Kettle. There's something else. Mr. Sutton's voice shifted slightly. Henry asked me to tell you something in person. He said to tell you that Ruth Calloway is the most trustworthy person in Clover Hill and that you should go to her first, before anyone else. He paused. He also said to be careful, that there were people who'd been watching the property, waiting to see what happened after he passed. He was concerned about protecting you from something, though he didn't tell me the specifics. A chill moved through me that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Who? I asked. He didn't say. Mr. Sutton looked at me steadily. But Henry Reeves was not a man who worried without reason. Ruth Calloway was 70 years old, built like someone who had spent decades refusing to be moved by anything, and she hugged me on her front porch before I'd even finished saying my name. I know who you are, she said into my hair. Henry described you to me so many times I'd know you anywhere. Come inside. I made biscuits. Her kitchen smelled like butter and wood smoke and something floral I couldn't name yet. Biscuit, the dog, not the food, appeared from under the table and pressed his entire body against my legs with the confidence of an animal who had already decided I was his person. Ruth poured coffee and set a plate in front of me and talked about my grandfather with the easy fluency of someone describing a beloved landscape they'd known their whole life. Henry Reeves had moved to Clover Hill 30 years ago from Nashville, she told me. He'd been a studio potter in the city, trained, professional, with gallery showings and collectors and a reputation that people in certain circles still mentioned with respect. But after my grandmother died, he'd wanted something quieter, something with soil in it. He bought that land with the last of his savings, Ruth said. Planted the lavender because he read it paired well with the clay from the local hills. Said the purple against the green made him feel like painting even when he wasn't. She looked at me. He built that studio himself over 3 summers. Every shelf, every kiln mount, every storage rack. He said if he built it himself, it would last. Why didn't he? I stopped. Started again. He knew where I was. For 15 years. Why didn't he try to contact me? Ruth was quiet for a moment. He did, Maya. For the first few years he tried. Letters that came back. Phone calls to caseworkers who wouldn't put him through. He hired a woman in Nashville to help him navigate the system. She took his money and told him the process could take years. By the time it fell apart, she shook her head. He was 68. He convinced himself that you had a life by then. That coming in would be disruption, not reunion. Her eyes were honest and sad. He was wrong to give up. He knew it. He told me so more than once toward the end. I pressed my hands flat on the kitchen table. Breathed. He left a box for me, I said. In the studio. I know. She nodded. He worked on it for the last 2 years of his life. Wouldn't show it to anyone. Just said it was the most important piece he ever made. Ruth drove me to the farm in the late afternoon. The driveway was unpaved, winding up a gentle hill between rows of lavender that were just beginning to show the faintest blush of color at the tips, still weeks from full bloom but already releasing their scent into the cool air. The farmhouse was small and weather-worn, yellow paint faded to something closer to cream, a deep porch running the length of the front with 2 rocking chairs that had clearly been used and loved. I stood at the base of the porch steps and tried to take it in. 14 acres. The lavender stretching east and west. The barn, painted the same faded yellow as the house, sitting solid and square behind the property. The hills rising beyond everything, holding the whole world in. I had never owned anything. Not a room. Not a drawer that was only mine. And this, all of this, had been waiting for me. Ruth gave me a key and squeezed my hand. Take your time, she said. I'll be home if you need anything. I walked the fields first. Moved through the lavender rows with my hands trailing over the plants, feeling the rough, soft texture of the stems, the oil releasing onto my palms with each brush. The soil was dark and faintly reddish, clay-heavy, Ruth had mentioned, the same clay my grandfather dug from the lower field to make his pottery. The barn doors were unlocked. When I pulled them open, the smell hit me first, clay and minerals and something dry and ancient, the smell of a place where good work had been done for a long time. The main space held garden equipment, a work table, shelving with seed packets organized by season and hand-labeled in my grandfather's neat script. But at the back, through a door left ajar, was the studio. I had expected craft supplies, shelves of clay and tools, and half-finished pieces. What I found was something closer to a life's work made physical. Every wall was lined with shelving holding finished pottery, bowls and vases and mugs and sculptural pieces that seemed to catch light and hold it. The glazes were extraordinary, colors that shifted as I moved, teal becoming green, amber becoming gold. In the center of the room sat a wheel, worn smooth with use. 2 quills stood against the far wall. Hundreds of tools hung from pegboards with the precision of someone who had learned that order was a form of respect. And on the back shelf, behind a row of glazed canisters labeled in the same careful handwriting, a box. It was roughly the size of a shoebox, made from clay so fine it looked almost like porcelain. The surface was carved all over with lavender sprigs in extraordinary detail, every stem, every tiny floret rendered with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world and chose to spend it on this. On the lid, in the same carved relief, Maya. I picked it up with both hands. It was heavier than it looked. It was sealed shut with a small clay latch, and when I pressed it, locked. No keyhole. No visible mechanism. Just a small indentation on the front of the box below my name in the shape of a thumbprint. I pressed my thumb into it. Nothing. I stood there in my grandfather's studio, surrounded by a lifetime of beautiful things he had made, holding a box with my name on it that I could not open, and I understood, somewhere beneath the frustration, that this was intentional, that whatever was inside was meant to be found when I was ready. I just didn't know yet what ready meant. That night, I stayed in my grandfather's house. I made tea in his kitchen, using leaves I found in a tin above the stove. I sat in one of the porch rockers with Biscuit's head in my lap and watched the Tennessee dark settle over the lavender fields. I thought I might feel lonely. Instead, I felt something stranger and quieter and more surprising. I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be, which meant, of course, that 3 days later, someone tried to take it from me. The man arrived on a Tuesday morning in a silver sedan that looked freshly washed, which struck me as odd for a dirt road. I was on the porch with coffee and Biscuit when he pulled up, stepping out in pressed khakis and a collared shirt with the careful ease of someone who had practiced looking unthreatening. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, with silver-streaked hair and a smile that arrived before the rest of his face had committed to it. "You must be Maya." He extended his hand as he came up the path. "Daniel Voss. I was a business associate of your grandfather's. Ceramics distribution. Henry supplied several of my gallery clients for years." I shook his hand because refusing would have told him too much. His grip was firm and just slightly too long. "He never mentioned you," I said carefully. The smile didn't waver. "We were professional, not personal. He was a private man." He looked past me at the farmhouse, the barn, the lavender fields, that same slow appraising sweep that made me feel like I was watching someone take inventory. Beautiful property. Must be worth considerably more than it was when Henry bought it. Land values in these hills have tripled in 10 years. "Can I help you with something, Mr. Voss?" He reached into his shirt pocket and produced a folded document, handed it to me with the practiced casualness of someone who had done this before. "I'm afraid there's a complication with the estate." His voice carried just enough regret to seem genuine. "Henry and I had a formal agreement, a commission contract. 40 custom pieces for a hospitality client in Nashville. He received a $15,000 advance 18 months ago. The pieces were never delivered." My stomach dropped before I'd even finished reading. The document looked real. Heavy paper, formal language, a signature at the bottom in handwriting that looked, almost exactly, like the careful script I'd seen on every seed packet and glaze canister in my grandfather's barn. "That debt transfers with the estate," Voss continued. which means it transfers to you. He tilted his head with an expression of rehearsed sympathy. I don't want to make this difficult, Maya. You've clearly just arrived, and you have enough to deal with. So, I'm prepared to offer a solution. He gestured at the land around us. I have a development partner interested in this property. $55,000.
Clean and fast.
That clears your debt and leaves you $20,000 to start fresh somewhere. $55,000 for 14 acres in the Cumberland foothills, a fully equipped professional pottery studio, a working lavender farm, and a farmhouse. I had been in the foster system for 15 years. I had been underestimated, overlooked, and processed like paperwork for most of my life. But I was not stupid. I need time to review this, I said. Of course. His smile tightened almost imperceptibly. 30 days. After that, I'll have no choice but to pursue legal remedies. Courts, liens, the whole process. He handed me a business card. Think carefully, Maya. This offer won't stay open. He drove away, and I stood in the driveway holding that contract, my grandfather's letter in my pocket, and the first cold fingers of real fear moving up my spine. Ruth Calloway listened to everything without interrupting. When I finished, she sat back in her kitchen chair and said one word. Voss. Something in the way she said it told me everything. You know him. I know of him. She got up and refilled both our coffees with the deliberate movements of someone organizing her thoughts. He's been circling properties in these hills for 4 years. Always the same. Waits until someone elderly passes, shows up with a contract claiming money owed, offers a buyout at a fraction of value. She set the pot down. He tried it with the Patton family 2 years ago. Widow, 73. No family close by. She nearly signed. Would have lost a property worth $200,000 for 60. What stopped her? Her granddaughter drove up from Chattanooga and recognized the contract for what it was. Ruth looked at me steadily. Same format. Same language. Different name at the top. So the signature. Almost certainly forged. Henry would never have done business with that man. I knew Henry Reeves for 22 years, and I can tell you he didn't trust developers, didn't take advances, and didn't sign contracts without his attorney present. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. There will be proof somewhere in that barn, Maya. Henry kept records of everything. Every transaction, every correspondence, every person he ever turned away. I thought about the studio. The perfectly organized shelves. The hand-labeled everything. The box with my name on it that I still couldn't open. I need to go through his files, I said. Then let's go, said Ruth. We spent 3 days in the barn studio going through filing boxes stacked under the work table, organized by year going back 2 decades. Invoices, gallery correspondence, kiln maintenance logs, property tax records. Ruth sat in the corner on a stool and kept me company while Biscuit patrolled the perimeter like a small dedicated security guard. On the second day, something else happened. A county vehicle pulled up the driveway. The woman who stepped out introduced herself as Loretta Penn, compliance officer for Cumberland County, and she was there, she said pleasantly, for a routine safety inspection of the studio workshop following the change of property ownership. She spent 90 minutes examining every inch. The kills, the wiring, the ventilation, the load-bearing capacity of the shelving. She made notes with the focused energy of someone looking not for problems but for specific problems. When she finished, she handed me a notice. 11 violations. The kiln electrical connections required certified inspection. Ventilation was below current code. 3 shelving units were improperly anchored. The studio was hereby ordered to suspend operations pending full remediation. Timeline? I asked, keeping my voice flat. 7 days to demonstrate compliance, or the building will be sealed. After she left, Ruth sat down on the barn steps and was quiet for a long moment. Loretta Penn, she said finally. She's been to 3 other properties in this county. Always right after Voss makes contact. Something cold and clarifying moved through me. This wasn't one man, with one forged contract. This was a system, inspection violations to make the owner desperate, legal threats to make them feel cornered, a lowball offer waiting at the end of the pressure, like a trapdoor. Designed for people with no resources, no connections, no one in their corner. People exactly like me. Except, I wasn't alone anymore. I called an emergency meeting at Ruth's kitchen table that evening. Ruth was already there. She'd called ahead without me asking, and when I walked in, 3 more people were seated with coffee cups in front of them like they'd been expecting exactly this. James Okafor, who ran the hardware store on Main Street and had known my grandfather for 15 years. Della Marsh, a retired schoolteacher who lived at the base of the hill and whose son, she mentioned calmly, was a licensed electrician. And Sheriff Pat Gideon, a broad-shouldered woman in her early 50s who set her hat on the table and looked at the violation notice I'd spread out with the expression of someone recognizing an old enemy.
Voss again, she said.
You know about him? I've been building a file on Daniel Voss for 3 years. Her voice was level. He's careful. Never crosses into anything obviously criminal. Forged signatures, fabricated contracts. It's hard to prove without the original documentation to compare. Most families just accept the settlement. She looked at me. The Patton case was the closest we came, but Mrs. Patton was too shaken to pursue it further. What would you need? I asked. To stop him. Original records proving your grandfather never entered any agreement with Voss. Something in Henry's own hand, a journal entry, a letter, a refusal documented somewhere. And ideally, a signature comparison showing the contract he gave you is a forgery. She leaned forward. Does the studio have anything like that? I've been through 2 years of files, I said. I haven't found it yet, but I haven't found the bottom of it yet either. Then find the bottom, said Sheriff Gideon. Della's son came the next morning with 2 colleagues and a truck full of equipment. Within 24 hours, the kiln wiring was upgraded and certified, the ventilation system was brought up to current code, and every shelf was properly anchored to code specifications with signed documentation. By the end of day 3, I had filed for a re-inspection with a different county inspector. The studio passed with no violations noted. Loretta Penn's weapon had dissolved. But Voss's deadline was still counting down. 22 days. And I still hadn't found what I needed. I found it on day 5. Not in the filing boxes. In the studio itself. I'd been watching my grandfather's instructional videos. A discovery from the first filing box. 41 USB drives numbered and dated, spanning nearly a decade. He'd recorded himself working, narrating his process in a voice so quiet and unhurried that watching them felt like sitting beside someone in a room where nothing bad could happen. In video 37, recorded 4 years ago, my grandfather paused in the middle of demonstrating a glazing technique and looked directly into the camera. I want to say something while I'm thinking of it, he said. A man named Daniel Voss came to this property last spring. He wanted me to sign a distribution contract. Exclusive rights to my work for 5 years, terms that would have given him 60% of every sale. He set down his brush. When I refused, he became unpleasant. He suggested he could make things difficult for a lone old man on a country property. I told him to leave. He held up a piece of paper. I documented the visit in my records. I want anyone watching this, Maya, if you're watching this, to know that I have never signed anything with that man. I never will. And if he ever comes to you claiming otherwise, he's lying. I paused the video. My grandfather looked out at me from 4 years ago, steady and certain, his clay-dusted hands folded in his lap. He had known. He had known years before his death that Voss might come. And he had left me a video record of it, time-stamped, dated, in his own voice and on his own property. I went back to the filing boxes with new focus. If he'd documented it verbally, he documented it in writing too. I found it at the bottom of the box labeled Correspondence, Declined. A single manila folder marked with a red tab. Inside was a letter dated 3 years ago, typed on Henry's old typewriter and signed at the bottom in his handwriting, a signature I'd come to know from 15 years of seed packets and glaze labels. And beneath it, a handwritten note in the margin. Voss came again today. Showed me a draft contract. Said he'd prepared it already, expecting me to sign. I did not sign. I am keeping this unsigned draft as evidence. He will try this again with me or with whoever comes after me. The unsigned draft was paper-clipped behind the letter. It was identical in format, language, and structure to the contract Voss had handed me on that Tuesday morning. The same template, The same paragraph ordering. Only the amounts and dates had been changed. I sat on the studio floor with a folder in my lap and Biscuit pressed against my side, and I felt something shift inside me. Not relief yet. Not victory. But the particular steadiness that comes from knowing you are not fighting alone, that someone who loved you thought ahead, planned carefully, and left you exactly what you needed. My grandfather had been afraid, too. And he had prepared anyway. I called Sheriff Gideon. "I found it," I said. "All of it." The morning Sheriff Gideon came to the farm to review everything. The lavender was beginning to open. Not fully, it was still early in the season, but enough. The eastern field had gone from pale green to the faintest wash of purple overnight. The way dawn changes a sky so gradually, you can't catch the exact moment it happens. I stood at the barn door watching it while Biscuit ran the perimeter fence with his usual morning dedication, and I thought about my grandfather standing in this same spot, watching this same field, carrying the weight of a choice he'd made 15 years ago, and never stopped regretting. I understood him better than I wanted to admit. Sheriff Gideon arrived at 8 o'clock with a deputy and a folder of her own. 3 years of documented complaints, patterns, property records connecting Voss to 7 other transactions in 4 counties. She spread everything on the studio work table beside what I'd found, and for a long time, she just stood there looking at it all assembled together. "This is it," she said quietly. "This is what we've been missing." I laid it out piece by piece. The video testimony, time-stamped, dated, my grandfather's voice clear and unhurried describing Voss's visit. The declined correspondence folder with its red tab. The unsigned draft contract, identical in every structural way to the one Voss had handed me. And the signed letter in my grandfather's hand documenting the second visit, the refused signature, the warning written in the margin in red ink. "He will try this again." Sheriff Gideon picked up the unsigned draft and held it beside the contract Voss had given me. "Same template," she said. "Same paragraph structure. Same clause language. He didn't even bother changing the boilerplate." She set them down. "And the signature on his contract. Your grandfather never signed this." "I know," I said. "Look at the R. and Reeves." She looked. In every document my grandfather had signed, the property records, the gallery invoices, the letter in the folder, the capital R had a distinctive quality, a small upward hook at the end of the second leg, like a question mark that had changed its mind. It was subtle enough to miss if you weren't looking. Obvious once you knew. The R on Voss's contract was smooth.
Clean.
Perfectly formed and entirely wrong. "He forged it from a photocopied sample," Sheriff Gideon said. "Someone who knew what they were doing, but didn't know about the hook." She looked at me. "Your grandfather ever mention why he wrote that way?" "No," I said. "But I think he knew. I think he made it distinctive on purpose." She nodded slowly. "Smart man." She took everything, certified copies, the originals secured in evidence bags with care that felt like respect. Before she left, she paused at the studio door and looked back at me. "I'm going to need you to be available Friday morning," she said. "Voss has been calling the county assessor's office asking about the property status. He's going to make his move soon, and I want to be ready when he does." "I'll be here," I said. "I know." Something in her expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but close to one. "Henry talked about you, Maya. Every time I saw him at the farmer's market, every town meeting, he'd find a way to mention his granddaughter in Memphis. Said he hoped you'd inherited your grandmother's stubbornness." She picked up her hat. "I think you did." Friday came in cool and clear, the kind of Tennessee spring morning that makes you understand why people write songs about this state. I was in the studio at 7, hands in clay for the first time since my arrival. I'd been watching my grandfather's videos every evening, following his beginner tutorials the way someone follows a map through unfamiliar country, carefully, with full attention, willing to get lost and find the way back. 3 nights ago, I had centered my first piece of clay on the wheel without it collapsing. 2 nights ago, I had brought up the walls of a small bowl, lopsided and thick but real. Last night, I had trimmed it and set it to dry on the shelf beside the window. It wasn't good. The walls were uneven and the rim tilted slightly left. But I had made it with my own hands, following my grandfather's patient instructions, and when I set it on the shelf, I had felt something move through me that it took a moment to name.
Pride.
The fragile, bright, entirely unfamiliar kind. I heard Voss's car on the gravel at 9:45. I walked out of the studio and around the barn and stood in the driveway with my arms loose at my sides and Biscuit sitting alert at my left heel. Voss stepped out of the silver sedan in another pressed outfit, but something about his manner was different today. Sharper. The performance of friendliness was gone. "I haven't heard from you," he said, coming up the drive without being invited. "I take that as a decision." "It is a decision," I said. "I'm not selling." Something moved across his face. "Maya, I don't think you understand the position you're in. That contract is legally binding. The debt is real. I have attorneys." "The contract is forged," I said.
He stopped.
"My grandfather documented your visits," I continued. "Both of them. He kept the insane draft you brought him the second time. He recorded a video describing the first visit in detail, time-stamped and dated. He wrote about you in his correspondence files." I held his gaze. "He knew you'd come back. He prepared for it. He left me everything I needed." The color had left Voss's face, with the efficiency of water draining from a tub. "That's a very serious accusation. It's a very documented one." Sheriff Gideon's cruiser came up the driveway then, followed by a second vehicle. She stepped out in full uniform, unhurried, and walked toward us with the steady calm of someone who had been waiting a long time for exactly this moment. "Daniel Voss." Her voice carried the particular authority of someone who needed no volume to command attention. "I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of fraud, forgery, and attempted theft by deception. There are additionally charges pending in connection with similar schemes in Walker and Putnam counties." She nodded to her deputy. "You have the right to remain silent." Voss looked at me as they moved toward him. His expression had gone through anger and fear and landed somewhere colder. "You got lucky," he said. "That's all this is." I thought about 15 years of instant oatmeal and narrow beds and learning not to unpack. I thought about my grandfather's videos, his patient voice walking me through the wheel and the clay and the fire. I thought about the box still sitting on the back shelf and what might be inside it, and the fact that I was still here, still standing, on land that had my family's name written into its soil for 30 years. "My grandfather spent years making sure I'd be ready," I said. "You came to the wrong farm, Mr. Voss." They put him in the back of the cruiser. Sheriff Gideon paused beside me before getting in. "Loretta Penn is being investigated for her role in the inspection scheme," she said. "3 other families are coming forward. Your grandfather's documentation is the cornerstone of the whole case." She looked at me with something that might have been admiration.
"He was a thorough man."
"He was," I said. I stood in the driveway long after the dust settled back onto the road, and then I let out a breath that felt like it had been stored somewhere deep for years, maybe my whole life, and the lavender fields spread out around me in the morning light, and I felt, for the first time, completely and without qualification, that this was mine. That evening, Ruth came with food and James Okafor brought 2 bottles of something local and sparkling, and Della Marsh came with her son the electrician who had never asked for a penny for the studio repairs. Sheriff Gideon stopped by in her civilian clothes. We sat on the porch as the sun went down over the Cumberland hills and Biscuit moved from lap to lap like a small ambassador of goodwill. At some point Ruth asked me quietly how I was feeling. I thought about it honestly. "Like I found something I didn't know I'd lost," I said. She nodded like that was exactly the right answer. Later, after everyone had gone, I went back to the studio alone. Sat at the wheel for a while without working, just letting the quiet settle around me. Then I went to the back shelf and took down the box with my name on it. I pressed my thumb into the indentation below my name again the way I had the first night, expecting nothing. This time, something clicked. The latch released. The lid lifted. I understood immediately. My thumbprint had changed. Not biologically. But the calluses on my fingertips had shifted from 2 weeks of working the clay, the pressure points slightly different, the ridges more defined. My grandfather hadn't locked the box with technology. He'd locked it with craft. With the knowledge that the hands that opened it would be different from the hands that arrived, that working the clay would change me in the precise and specific way that would make the difference. I had to become someone before I could open it. Inside were three things. A small journal, hand-bound in leather with clay-dusted pages, recording 30 years of pottery techniques, glaze formulas, kiln temperatures, notes in the margins that were half instruction and half philosophy. A love letter to the craft, written one entry at a time over 3 decades. A brass key on a faded ribbon, with a tag that read Storage Unit 4, Clover Hill Self-Storage, Route 9, and when I drove there the following morning, I found a unit stacked with 30 years of my grandfather's finest work, set aside and never sold, labeled in his handwriting, for Maya, her inheritance in clay. And at the very bottom of the box, wrapped in a square of worn cotton, a photograph, small and slightly faded. A young woman with dark hair and my exact cheekbones, laughing at something off-camera, standing in the eastern lavender field with the hills rising behind her. On the back, in my grandfather's writing, "Your mother, Annabelle, age 19. She loved this field best. I always hoped she'd come back to it. I hope you'll love it for her." I sat on the studio floor for a long time holding that photograph, grieving and grateful in equal measure, the way you can be when love arrives late, but proves it was always real. My mother had stood in my field. She had loved this land. And somehow, through all the broken years and mischances, it had found its way to me. 5 years. That's how long it took for the farm to become fully, completely, undeniably home. Though if I'm honest, some part of me knew it from the first night, from the porch rocking chair and the lavender smell and biscuits had heavy and warm in my lap. 5 years of learning. Of failing and trying again, and failing differently. Of watching the lavender come up each spring like a promise the land was making and keeping simultaneously. Of sitting at my grandfather's wheel until the clay stopped fighting me and started talking to me, the way he described in his videos, in that quiet voice that had become as familiar to me as any voice I'd known. I wasn't my grandfather. I never would be. His work had a quality I still reached for, a quality that came from decades of refined understanding that I was only beginning to develop. But I had something of my own now, a style that the galleries in Nashville and Knoxville had started to recognize, pieces that sold before they were finished drying, a waiting list that made me simultaneously grateful and slightly panicked. The lavender farm became its own thing too, with help I never could have managed alone. Ruth connected me with a cooperative of small Tennessee farms, and the lavender, dried, bundled, distilled into oil that I started selling alongside the pottery, became the second language of Reeves' farm, which was what the sign at the foot of the driveway now read. Reeves Farm. EST 1994. Pottery and Lavender. H&M Reeves. I'd added my initial beside his. Ruth cried when she saw it. I pretended not to notice, so she could have the moment privately. The first young person came in my second year. Her name was Cora, 19 years old, referred by a social worker in Nashville who had somehow heard our story. The inheritance, the fight, the farm that became something. Cora showed up on a Wednesday afternoon in October with a garbage bag of belongings and the specific expression I recognized instantly, having worn it myself. The one that says I am waiting for the catch. I showed her the studio, showed her the wheel, the kills, the 30 years of journals stacked on the shelf. Showed her my grandfather's videos. "You can stay in the back bedroom," I said. "Help with the lavender harvest in spring. Learn the studio if you want. If you don't want, that's fine too. There's no catch." She looked at me for a long moment. "Everyone says that," she said. "I know," I said. "Stay anyway." She stayed. She had a gift for form that showed up in her 3rd week at the wheel, an instinct for proportion that took most people years to develop. Within 6 months, she was making pieces that stopped people in their tracks. Within a year, she was teaching Saturday workshops to visitors from Cookeville and Crossville, passing on what she'd learned with the generous fluency of someone who understood firsthand what it meant to be given something real. She stopped flinching when good things happened. That was the change I noticed most. After Cora came Marcus, then 2 sisters named Priya and Senna who arrived together and were inseparable and are still here today. Then a boy named Eli who is better with the lavender than the clay and now manages the eastern field with a precision that would have made my grandfather nod with respect. Then others over the years, some who stayed, some who moved on carrying skills and steadiness they hadn't arrived with. We never called it a program. It wasn't organized or branded or funded by anyone. It was just what happened when you had space and knowledge, and the memory of what it felt like to need exactly that. My grandfather had tended this land for 30 years, waiting for me to come. I tended it for whoever came next. In my 4th year, I finished the piece I'd been building toward since the beginning. A memorial urn, made from the red clay soil of the lower field. The same clay my grandfather had always said held the particular character of this specific piece of land, irreplaceable, itself and nothing else. I spent 4 months on it, more time than I'd spent on anything. The surface was carved with lavender in the same style as the box he'd made for me, stem by stem, floret by floret, the same patience he'd put into carving my name. On the base, in letters pressed into the clay before firing, Henry Reeves. He built with his hands and loved with everything else. I placed it on the studio shelf beside his first piece, a small lopsided bowl from his own beginner years that I'd found in the storage unit, labeled in his handwriting with gentle self-deprecation, Attempt 1. Not terrible. His Attempt 1 beside my Attempt 1. Separated by decades and connected by clay and blood and the strange long road that had brought me here. On the 5th anniversary of my arrival, I sat on the porch in the early evening as the lavender fields went purple gold in the setting sun. Ruth was inside with Cora, finishing dinner. Eli was closing up the eastern field. Somewhere in the studio, I could hear Priya and Senna talking, punctuated by laughter. Biscuit, old now and slower, was asleep with his chin on my foot. I had my grandfather's last journal open in my lap. I'd been reading it slowly for months, a page or two at a time, rationing it the way you ration something you know is finite. His voice came off the pages the way it came from the videos, unhurried, precise, occasionally funny in a dry way that had caught me off guard the first time. The last entry was dated 8 months before he died. The lavender is nearly up. Another week and the eastern field will be full bloom. I've been thinking about Maya today. I think about her most days, but especially in spring when this place is most itself. I wonder if she'll like the smell. I wonder if she'll find the clay talking to her the way it talked to me. I wonder if she's stubborn. I hope she's stubborn. Stubborn people survive. I won't be here to show her. That's the hardest part, knowing there are things I could have taught her in person that the videos can't quite carry. The particular pressure of a thumb at the rim when the clay starts to waver. The exact moment you know a piece is ready to come off the wheel. Things that live in the hands, not the mind. But maybe she'll figure it out. She comes from people who figured things out. I love you, Maya. I'm sorry I waited so long to say it where you could hear it. I closed the journal carefully. The sun was finishing its work on the horizon, the sky going from gold to amber to the particular deep blue that comes just before the stars. An owl called from the tree line the way owls do in Tennessee, sudden and sure, and entirely unbothered by anything. I thought about everything that had carried me here. The narrow bed and the duffel bags. The cream-colored envelope and the smell of lavender. The box I couldn't open until my hands had changed. The forged signature with its missing hook. The community that showed up with tools and time, and the absolute expectation that this farm would be defended. My grandfather hadn't been able to give me my childhood. The years between 6 and 21 were simply gone. Not recoverable, not replaceable. A loss I had learned to hold without letting it hollow me out. But he had given me what came after. He had spent 30 years building something and keeping it and tending it and waiting, and then he had trusted me with all of it. And I had not let it go. Ruth appeared at the screen door. Dinner's ready. Cora made cornbread. Coming, I said. I set the journal on the rocking chair beside me and looked out at the lavender fields one more moment. The purple rose running east and west, the barn solid behind the house, the hills holding everything in their ancient green hands. 5 generations of some families grew up knowing exactly where they came from. I had 21 years of not knowing, followed by 5 years of learning it all at once, in clay and lavender, and other people's memories of a man I never got to meet, but somehow knew completely. It was not the story I would have chosen, but it was mine. Every acre of it. every cracked and rebuilt piece of it. And in the morning, I would go back to the wheel, and the clay would tell me what it wanted to become. I was finally learning how to listen. Thank you for staying with Maya's entire journey. If this story moved you, I'd love to hear which moment hit you hardest. Drop it in the comments below. And if you've ever found family in an unexpected place, or discovered you were loved in ways you didn't know, share your story. This community is built on those moments. Subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Until then, it's never too late to find where you belong.
Herb.